July 1966, Central Vietnam. The day began like hundreds of others. Heat, humidity, dust mixed with sweat. U.S. Army Infantry Captain Richard Collins stood at the edge of a freshly cleared section of jungle, watching an engineer platoon slowly strip away vegetation with a bulldozer. The area was considered swept. No contact. According to reports, empty. The metallic grinding suddenly stopped. The bulldozer operator cut the engine and jumped down. Beneath the blade, the soil was exposed. And beneath the soil, something else. Collins stepped closer. A hand protruded from the mud, dry, almost black. The fingers clenched, as if the man had died without loosening his grip. It was an enemy soldier. Judging by the condition, he had been lying there for a long time. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year. The body had nearly become part of the earth itself. But in his hands, there was a weapon, a rifle. Collins bent down, grasped the stock, and carefully pulled it from the ground. The metal was coated with residue, the wood darkened by moisture. He instinctively checked the magazine. Full. 30 rounds. He pulled the bolt. It moved stiffly, but it moved. Then it returned forward with a dull, metallic sound. "Watch this," Collins said, without raising his voice. He stepped back a few paces, raised the rifle, aimed toward the cleared area, and pulled the trigger. The burst was short even, confident. No stoppages, no misfires, no pauses. 30 rounds, textbook perfect. The rifle performed as if it had just been taken from an armory, not pulled out of Vietnamese soil. It went quiet around them. No one applauded. No one joked. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Someone looked down. Everyone knew what the others were thinking, but no one said it out loud. Because each of them had already heard another sound. Not a burst, but a dry, metallic click. The sound their own rifle made when it was supposed to fire, and didn't. Collins slowly lowered the weapon. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look impressed. He looked cautious, like a man who had just realized that the war he was fighting was not the war he had been told about. "This," he finally said, "is a weapon that doesn't care about dirt." He paused, then added, "And maybe that's exactly why it's going to win here." That day, no reports were written, no photographs were taken. But for those who stood there, it was the moment after which the war stopped being theoretical. It became very personal and very dangerous. In Vietnam, a firefight rarely began with a shot. More often, it began with a feeling. First came the silence, too dense for the jungle. Then movement that couldn't be pinned down by sight. A leaf trembled. A branch shifted, not with the wind. And in the next second, space collapsed into a few dozen meters, turning into a narrow corridor of fear with no flanks and no rear. Contact. The distances were absurd by textbook standards. 30 meters, sometimes less. There was no time for calculations, adjustments, or clean, deliberate single shots. Everything was decided in the first seconds. Who would start firing? And whose weapon would keep firing after the first shots? That was where the problems began. U.S. Army soldiers quickly learned a sound that appeared in no manual. Not the crack of a shot, not recoil, but an empty, dull click. Metallic, almost mocking. It meant one thing: the weapon had failed. In heat approaching 40 degrees and humidity that turned everything into a sticky mass, rifles began to behave unpredictably. Dirt got everywhere. Sand clung to lubricant. Powder residue mixed with moisture. After a few magazines, the mechanism slowed, and then stopped. In theory, a soldier was supposed to clear the malfunction. In reality, there was no time. Fingers slipped. The heart pounded so hard, it drowned out everything else. While one man tried to understand what had happened to his weapon, someone else was already firing, from the other side. The AK-47 didn't stand out for accuracy. It didn't look elegant. But it fired. In the rain, in the mud, after falling, after being dragged across the ground. It fired when the weapon was asked for only one thing: not to fail. American soldiers began to understand this with their bodies. Not through reports, not through statistics, but through moments when life depended on a simple mechanical action. You pressed, and you got a response. Or you didn't. After several such contacts, behavior changed. Men fired shorter bursts, checked their weapons more often, cleaned them, even when they were exhausted to the point of collapse. But doubt had already taken root, and doubt in combat kills faster than a bullet. Commanders heard the complaints. But at the unit level, it all looked like isolated incidents, like bad luck, like user error. No one was talking about a system yet. They talked about dirt, about climate, about soldiers who didn't take proper care of their weapons. And the jungle kept closing in. Contacts became more frequent, and each new click made the question louder. What if next time it happens again? The rifle American soldiers entered Vietnam with was not born in the jungle. It was born in clean rooms, on drafting tables, and in conference halls where the primary threat was not dirt, but falling behind the future. In the early 1960s, the Pentagon was searching for a new generation of weapon. Lightweight, modern, something that would match the image of a high-tech army. Old rifles seemed like relics of the past. Heavy, wooden, yesterday's tools. The new war, as those at the top believed, was to be fought by a different soldier with a different weapon. That was how the concept of a rifle that won on paper came to life. It was lighter. It allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. It offered good accuracy. In laboratory conditions, it performed excellently. Tests were conducted on ranges where weapons were cleaned, according to regulations, and fired in controlled environments. There, the rifle worked. And that turned out to be enough. Decisions were made quickly. Production was ramped up. Shipments of weapons were sent overseas. It was assumed that soldiers would gain an advantage the enemy did not have. Documents used words like breakthrough, future, and firepower superiority. But between those words and reality lay thousands of kilometers, and a different war. In the jungle, nothing was dry. Nothing was clean. There was no time for maintenance. Weapons were carried for days. Soldiers slept with them. They dropped them, dragged them through water, clay, and vines. The rifle needed to work not when everything was perfect, but when everything had gone wrong. That was not part of the calculations. Instructions promised simplicity. Some officers seriously believed the new weapon required minimal care. Cleaning kits were not issued immediately. Lubricants were selected without accounting for the climate. Changes to ammunition were approved without fully testing how they would affect the weapon's operation. Each of these decisions seemed minor. Each seemed logical when separated from the front. And each was dangerous when combined. While soldiers on the ground were learning to survive with a weapon that demanded ideal conditions, the enemy was using an automatic rifle that didn't care where it was. The gap between expectation and reality grew. But those at the top did not see it, or did not want to see it, because admitting a problem meant admitting a mistake. And mistakes in large systems are always something people try to wait out. Meanwhile, the war did not wait, and the jungle did not forgive. The first casualties caused by weapon failures did not enter reports as anything unusual. They dissolved into the general statistics. Killed in action. Enemy contact. Firefight. The wording was the same, while the causes were different. But at the squad level, it looked very different. In the autumn of 1966, in an area not far from the Cambodian border, a U.S. infantry patrol walked into an ambush. The contact was short and violent. The enemy let them get close. Too close. The first shots were fired almost simultaneously from both sides. Within seconds, everything went wrong. One soldier went down immediately. The second tried to cover the withdrawal, but his rifle fell silent after the first shots. He pulled the charging handle. Nothing. A round was jammed. While he tried to clear the malfunction, a burst from the other side cut through the space in front of him. It all took less than a minute. Those who survived later remembered not the fight itself, but the silence afterward. Not the sounds of gunfire, but the pause in which it became clear that something had gone wrong. The weapon had failed to perform its one essential task. Such episodes repeated themselves, not on a massive scale, not every day, but often enough that soldiers began connecting the dots. After engagements, rifles were stripped right there on the ground. Inside, they found a thick black mass, a mixture of carbon fouling, dirt, and moisture. Sometimes spent casings were stuck so tightly, they had to be driven out with improvised tools. Letters home changed in tone. At first cautious, then more direct. Soldiers asked families to send brushes, oil, rags. Not souvenirs, not food. Things that would give the weapon at least a chance to work. Some wrote plainly. The rifle was letting them down. Company commanders reported upward. The language was restrained. Isolated cases. Operational issues. Need for additional training of personnel. No one was talking about a systemic failure yet. That word sounded too serious. But for those on the ground, the question was no longer abstract. It was personal. Every new patrol into the jungle came with the same thought. What if today, the weapon fails again? It didn't paralyze them, but it changed behavior. Soldiers fired earlier, took extra precautions, avoided prolonged contacts. Trust in their own rifle became something that had to be earned every day, and far from always was it earned. The first blood was not spilled in offices. It was spilled where mistakes had no right to exist. The first widespread encounter with the AK-47 did not happen immediately. At first, it came in isolated contacts, short firefights, night engagements. The enemy rifle was glimpsed only briefly, in the hands of a retreating silhouette, in the glow of tracers, in moments when it was already too late to study details. Then came clashes where everything became clear. In early 1967, several American units encountered an enemy that did not withdraw right away. Contacts became denser, distances shorter, fire more sustained. And it was precisely then that soldiers began noticing a strange pattern. The enemy's rifles did not fall silent. The sound of the AK was instantly distinctive. It was deeper, rougher. Not a sharp crack, but a mechanical clack-clack, as if a heavy part were being driven into metal again and again. That sound did not break, not in the rain, not after the shooter fell into the mud and got back up. And then the tracers appeared. At night they looked almost unreal, green arcs coming out of the darkness. Not flashes, but streams. American soldiers were used to red tracers. They knew them. These were different, alien. And psychologically, they pressed harder than the fire itself. After engagements, captured weapons began to be examined more closely, taken apart, tested. Some did it quietly, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. The AK was heavy, awkward, crude. But inside, it was empty in a good way. Large clearances, simple mechanics, nothing unnecessary. It did not demand care. It tolerated neglect. Soldiers saw the enemy pull a rifle out of water, shake it off, and keep firing. They saw the AK work after falling, after impact, after things that would have disabled their own weapons. The comparison happened on its own. No one said it out loud yet. No one wrote it in reports. But on the level of instinct, the conclusion had already been reached. The enemy's weapon was built for this war. Theirs was not. From that moment on, the AK stopped being just the enemy's weapon. It became the reference point, and everything that followed was measured against it. The decision to take up captured weapons was not made immediately. At first, it felt unacceptable, a violation, almost a betrayal. Soldiers were taught to trust the weapons they were issued, to follow instructions, to rely on the system. Using the enemy's weapon meant admitting that the system had failed. But war left no room for abstract principles. The first to make that choice were those who went far and stayed out long. Reconnaissance teams, deep penetration patrols, men for whom extraction was not a guarantee, but a hope. They quickly understood the arithmetic of survival. A weapon had to fire every time, even if it hadn't been cleaned, even if the ammunition had been taken on the spot. The AK-47 fit those conditions perfectly. At first, the rifles were carried just in case. Then, they were used in ambushes. Later, they were taken along as primary weapons. Formally, no one authorized this, but no one rushed to seriously forbid it either. Commanders on the ground saw the results. They saw who came back and who didn't. The reasons were cold and practical. First, reliability. The AK forgave mistakes. It kept working where other weapons demanded ideal conditions. Second, ammunition. AK rounds were everywhere. Every cache, every trail, every engagement offered a chance to resupply. For units cut off from logistics, this was a decisive factor. There was a third element, psychological. The sound of the AK in combat caused hesitation. The enemy heard the familiar clack-clack and lost orientation for a fraction of a second. Those seconds decided everything. In that time, it was possible to change position, break out of an encirclement, escape. No one planned this as a tactic. It emerged on its own. The soldiers who made this choice did not see themselves as rebels. They didn't argue doctrine. They simply wanted to survive. And every time a captured rifle functioned without failure, confidence in the decision grew stronger. Regulations remained on paper. In the jungle, a different law applied. And the further the war went, the more soldiers understood. Sometimes, to come back alive, you had to break a rule written by people who would never be at that distance of fire. Signals from below did not reach the command immediately. They rose slowly, getting lost in wording, softened as they moved upward. Reports did not say, "The weapon doesn't work." They said it more carefully. "Stoppages have been observed. Difficulties arise during operation in conditions of high humidity. Personnel require additional training." But when the same phrases began to repeat too often, ignoring them became impossible. By mid-1967, the problem had moved beyond individual units. Complaints were coming from different areas, from different formations, from officers who didn't know each other and could not have coordinated their accounts. The weapon, that was supposed to symbolize technological superiority, was increasingly becoming a source of anxiety. Inspections began at headquarters. At first, quiet ones, internal, without publicity. Engineers examined returned rifles, analyzed stuck casings, compared ammunition batches. The picture that emerged was unpleasant. It turned out that changes made in production and supply had consequences that decision-makers preferred not to consider at the time. But admitting this publicly was difficult. Every admission pulled a chain of questions behind it. Who approved it? Who signed off? Who decided the testing was sufficient? In a large system, responsibility is rarely personal. It dissolves, moves from department to department. In the end, no one is found guilty. Only wording is found. On the front lines, this was felt immediately. Fixes were implemented slowly. Some units received modified weapons. Others continued fighting with the old ones. Cleaning kits began to arrive, but not everywhere. Manuals were rewritten, but soldiers no longer trusted the words. This was felt most painfully by mid-level officers, those directly responsible for their men. They had to explain to subordinates why the weapon was failing them, while at the same time convincing them to continue trusting the system. It was a heavy fracture between orders and reality. Meanwhile, higher up, efforts were made to keep the problem within the military. A scandal would have meant undermining trust not only in the weapon, but in the very way the war was being fought. and the war already demanded too many justifications. The system knew the truth, but it spoke of it in a whisper, and the soldiers in the jungle drew conclusions without reports or commissions. They looked not at paperwork, but at which weapon fired in the next contact. And more often, that choice was made long before the fight began. The enemy quickly understood where the boundary of American advantage lay. It was not in the sky and not on maps. It was in distance. North Vietnamese units and Viet Cong formations deliberately sought to close the gap, not out of bravery, out of calculation. The closer they got, the less aviation, artillery, and long-range fire mattered. At 50 meters, war turned into a clash of people, not systems. And here, the AK-47 revealed itself fully. It was not designed for precision fire at long ranges. Its sights were crude. But in close combat, that didn't matter. What mattered was something else: volume of fire and confidence that the weapon would work every single time. The enemy acted methodically, closed in fast, worked the flanks, pressed with fire. American soldiers called it getting right on top of you. When the distance became so small that calling in support from above was dangerous. Any strike could hit friendly forces. Under these conditions, the fight became chaos. Short bursts, sharp movements, instant decisions. There was no room for doubt. Any weapon stoppage could cost a life. The AK kept firing. Its round punched through brush, thin walls, doors. It did not deflect as often as lighter bullets. In urban fighting and dense structures, this gave the enemy an additional advantage. Soldiers understood. They could be fired on without even being seen directly. Psychological pressure grew. The sound of the AK became a trigger. The body reacted faster than the mind. Adrenaline dumped instantly. Some veterans later said that this was the sound they heard in their dreams for years afterward. Not because it was louder, but because it meant one thing: the enemy's weapon worked. American units tried to adapt. They changed tactics, improved coordination. But at close range, everything once again came down to one simple thing: reliability. And every new fight confirmed the same rule. In this war, victory did not belong to the one with the better plan. It belonged to the one whose weapon did not fail in the decisive second. By the end of 1967, changes finally began reaching the front. Not immediately, not simultaneously, not for everyone. But the process had started. Weapons were modified. Chambers began to be chrome-lined. Ammunition was changed. Proper cleaning kits appeared. Manuals were rewritten, as if the problem had always been known and already solved. On paper, everything looked like logical evolution rather than a response to a crisis. In practice, it was different. Units that received the updated rifles did notice improvements. Failures became less frequent. Mechanisms worked more consistently. But something had already been lost. It wasn't steel. It was trust. Soldiers who had fought through 1966 and early 1967 did not forget. Even when the weapon began working better, the memory of the moments when it failed remained. Every new contact still began with a check. The doubt did not disappear. This was felt most sharply by veterans who had suffered losses because of weapon failures. For them, any fixes looked late. People could not be brought back. The mistakes had already been paid for. Command tried to turn the page. New units entered the war already equipped with improved weapons and did not always understand what the older men were talking about. To them, the stories of failures sounded almost like legend, exaggeration, a past phase. But those who had been there earlier knew the cost. Even after the improvements, many units continued to keep captured rifles, not always using them, but keeping them close, as a reserve, as a reminder, as a last argument if everything went wrong again. The fixes solved the technical problem, but they did not erase the experience. It was at this moment that something became clear. War leaves marks not only on the land and on bodies. It leaves them in the relationship between the soldier and the system that sent him. And that mark does not disappear with new modifications. The war did not end at the moment when the weapon became more reliable, and not even when the last shots fell silent. It ended later, in memory. For the Army, the system drew conclusions. There were reports. There were reforms. There were new testing standards. Mistakes were acknowledged partially, cautiously, without personal accountability. Formally, the crisis was considered closed. The weapon was improved. The problem solved. But for the soldiers, the story ended differently. Those who lived through the early years of the war carried away a simple and heavy lesson. In combat, you cannot trust promises. You cannot trust presentations. You cannot trust words about the future. You can trust only what works in a specific moment, under specific fire. The AK-47 became the symbol of exactly that lesson. It was not perfect. It was uncomfortable, crude, inaccurate at long distances. But it fired, every time, in mud, in water, in dust. When a single pull of the trigger meant life or death. That is why it was remembered. American veterans did not remember the AK with respect for the enemy. They remembered it with a cold acknowledgement of fact. In that war, in those conditions, this weapon matched reality. Not doctrine, not intent, reality. Many of them later said that the most painful part was not the mechanical failures. It was the realization that they had been sent to fight with a weapon unprepared for that war. That someone made a decision thousands of kilometers away, and the price for it was paid at a distance of 50 meters. The AK-47 did not win the war, but it won trust. And that trust proved stronger than technology, stronger than concepts, stronger than words. It passed from soldier to soldier, from memory to memory, from war to war. That is why, decades later, when veterans remember Vietnam, they often do not remember the bombings, the politics, or the operational maps. They remember the sound, the heavy clack-clack in the jungle, and the feeling that the man firing had a weapon that would work. And in war, sometimes that is enough to stay alive.